So good morning, and thanks, Robert, for the introduction. I think you will see very soon the pictures and the bios. So I'm gonna be very quick introducing this panel. I think we had a very good start of the conference with this framing by Andres. We'll just get a little bit deeper on some of the more technical issues, but taking into account that we have to keep in mind what Andres has just shared with us. So we have here in this panel, and just I'm going to go from that corner on, Simon Evenett. He's the professor of geopolitics and strategy at IMD, a leading business school in Lausanne. He's also the co-chair of the World Economic Forum, Trade and Investment Global Council, many other things, but I want to in particular emphasize his job as a founder of a very important leading monitoring tool, the GTA, the Global Trade Alert. If you want to know anything you want on trade policy, go to the GTA. He has now expanded that database into monitoring industrial policy and digital tools. So it's a really good tool for following trade policy. Next, we have Meredith Lilly. He's a professor at Carleton University at the School of International Affairs. She has a long academic background, but also she has been at the policy working on at the policy level with she was the trade advisor of the Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and it's a very important voice in North America. So anything you want to know about Canada, US, Mexico, North America, we'll have time to discuss with her these issues. Next to Meredith, we have Carlos Grau. He's a director at the Geneva-based Association of Global Express Association, basically the group that represents the major leading express carriers, service carriers, logistic companies, DHL, UPS, and FedEx. So it's an expert on issues of customs, logistics, trade facilitation, anything on this topic. Next to Carlos, we have Luz Maria de la Mora, who is now director of the Trade and Commodity Division at UNCTAD. She was the Vice Minister of Trade in Mexico. She has led so many negotiations, I don't know how many, 15, 20 FTAs of Mexico. As you know, Mexico is one of these countries with so many trade agreements. She has been in many of those involved. So great to have you here also, Luz Maria. And finally, not the last but not least, Cristina. Cristina Serradell is our local presence here. She's the director of the International Trade Unit at ACCIÓ, which is kind of the trade promotion agency of Catalonia. So we want to bring also this kind of local perspective. So let me just start just as a brief kind of introduction to the panel, kind of a 2 minutes story of the global trading system, which is what we're supposed to discuss here. Where are we going? Where we are on that? And if we want to tell this story in 2 minutes, I think we can look at the 3 chapters of this building, this architecture that we have today. The first chapter probably runs around 50 years, and this goes from the aftermath of World War II, when the Bretton Woods institutions were created, more or less until the end of the 20th century. I will put a date there, maybe 1999 would be a good way to kind of close this first chapter. This is the time during almost 5 decades that the world basically built this architecture based on the multilateral, what we call the multilateral rules-based system. First based on the GATT system, and then the highlight of the system came into 1994 with the creation of the WTO. So these were 50 years of slowly building a very strong system of regulating trade around the world. And then came the 1999. If you want to put today, there's a dispute on when this inflection point came, but I think 1999 would be a good year to close this chapter and start a new one, which some of you may remember. This was the Seattle Ministerial, where the WTO massively basically failed in launching a new round of multilateral negotiations. Some of you may remember the protest around Seattle at the time. Some of you maybe were there, actually. Yeah. And the round was launched 2 years later. You may know the Doha round, very famous Doha round that was never concluded. Has never been concluded, and since then, basically, the WTO has been unable to sign any other multilateral agreement, except with some exceptions. Trade facilitation is one, but basically a system that was already under a lot of stress from the beginning of this century. there were no multilateral agreements, as I said, from that point on. There were some crises in between, especially the financial crisis was a big shock to the system. Also, in this second chapter of this story, and in the backdrop of all this was China. China emerging as a really big power that changed the rules of the game. And structurally, I think the global economy was basically characterized by what we call now this huge fragmentation of global production, this the rise of global value chains. This has been the way that the global economy has functioned in the last in this second chapter. And to put the date to this second chapter and to start the third chapter, which is basically what we are here for, there's a kind of different ways of looking at the inflection point. I would put probably the inflection point around COVID. COVID really changes the way that we think about the vulnerabilities that this global value chain had. And this is when we start hearing the policy, in the policy language, you start hearing the words of strategic autonomy, local content, incentives to local content, export controls. All these policy shifts start happening around the COVID time. Nearshoring type of the concepts is where we use it. But beyond COVID, I think there are two, and I think Andres has referred a little bit to that, two major structural changes in the last 5, 6, 7 years that are been basically changing the landscape of the global trade architecture. One is on geopolitics. We can get into the details here. The impact of geopolitics on trade, what we call the weaponization of trade, the links of security and trade, the displacement of the logic of the rules by the logic of powers and strategic alliances. This is kind of the talk of the town now. And the second kind of big structural change is all that has to do with the disruptive technologies and how we're going to regulate what is now becoming more and more important in trade, which is not anymore trade in goods, but trade actually in services, trade in data, how we actually going to regulate this new kind of wall of trade. So with this kind of brief introduction, the first thing I would like to ask our panel, maybe it's a kind of a generic question to all of you. How do you see this wall in where we live, this third chapter, where we are on that? Do you see this is just kind of a small change in kind of a temporary adjustment to globalization? Is something that will happen, will end in a few years, something, or it's a really transformative change that we don't know yet exactly the type of rules that we will see as we move forward. So it's just a generic reflection about where you see where we are, maybe how we got here also, but where we are on this. Maybe start with Simon. We'll just move this way. Maybe just a few minutes on that.
Sure. So thanks, Tony. I'm going to try and describe to you how my thinking is evolving. I don't want to make it sound like I've come to a definitive view yet, because I'm still trying as a free trade, hopefully open-minded, certainly interested in openness, how I'm having to mentally adjust to this new world with geopolitics. So I'm going to break the argument down in steps. So first, security considerations are rewiring the trading system. Okay? Second, this is not unprecedented. We have been through this before, and there are two episodes we should talk about. But let's just be clear about where we are now. We have the United States, the primary economic power, feeling threatened by a rise in China. Why? One, possibilities of weaponization, that is being cut off from supplies, rare earths, example one. Second reason they're worried is because there are many items with goods with the Internet of Things, where either data is being transferred across borders and possibly being used inappropriately, and where there are kill switches, potentially, in these technologies, which could threaten continuity of supply. And so this is a dimension talking about the things we liberal internationalists didn't think about. Add these to the list. The second big reason the US is worried is because the very growth of exports, which led to growth of GDP, which I and others welcome and championed, has enabled China to increase its military expenditure to challenge that of the United States. When China joined the WTO, its military spending was 5 to 7% of the United States'. Now it's 30% to 30 to 35%. And that's not correcting for price differences. That would narrow the gap even more. The third reason is that as China is growing and developing its own scientific base, it is now potentially bidding to be the leader in many of the next generation of technologies. And you can measure this in lots of different ways. There's an Australian outfit which tries to do this, produces relatively alarming numbers, like 57 out of 64 of tomorrow's technologies are already being developed by China in advance of the United States. Who knows if those numbers are right, but it's the type of thing which causes people who live and work in offices with no windows in Washington to lose sleep. Right? So let's understand. So that's the sort of part of Simon's mental adjustment. Empathizing, not necessarily sympathizing, with the people who worry about security issues. Next step in the argument. This is not the first time this has happened. The US has seen off two challenges to its primacy in the last 100 years. First, the Soviet Union. It took 40 years. Second, Japan in the 80s and 90s. It did it in two very, it did it actually in the same GATT regime. And I think this is super important. Let's talk about that era a little bit more. When the Americans constructed the GATT regime with allies, they restricted its membership to allies plus some developing countries. There were some exceptions. Poland was allowed in 1967 into the GATT, but often not many. So essentially, that was a regime in which we had the development of these multilaterals, which we all like, but it was a pretty exclusive regime. The Warsaw Pact was kept out. In fact, they were kicked out in 1950. Right? So solution one is, yeah, you can have a rules-based system which develops, puts in place new rules, but it's going to be much more exclusive, based around probably a group of democracies, not too different from the set which Andrea showed us earlier. So that's one part of the American playbook. The second part of the playbook has to do with the rise of Japan. Japan was already in the system when the Japanese had the temerity to challenge the United States. Okay? Now, fortunately for the United States, Japan blew up internally with a financial crisis, which was absolutely astonishing in 1989. But before that happened, the Americans engaged in huge amounts of unilateralism. Guys like Jagdish Bhagwati even wrote books called Aggressive Unilateralism. And if you look back at that phase there, this is essentially a minor version of what we're seeing now. So the Americans have got two playbooks. I would suggest from that history alone, we learn that we either have two routes ahead of us. One, the trading systems membership is going to have to narrow very significantly if the Americans are going to stay involved in a constructive way. Or if this membership becomes very, very large, then the trading system is going to fragment either along lines of spheres of influence or possibly Western countries versus the China bloc and a huge number of non-allied countries. So that's how I see this unfolding. As I said, my thinking on this is very much in flux. So one of the reasons why I still come to academic conferences, even though I spend more of my time now with CEOs and senior officials, is precisely to be challenged on this type of thinking. So please push back.
Meredith, you can do that here.
I won't push back just yet. I think a lot of that makes sense. But what I will do is talk about where I think the global trading order is going, but starting with a very concrete example, which is from Canada. We're a country that is one of the most that's exposed to trade with the United States and the aggressive unilateral action that we're seeing from the States. So you need to know that 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. 15% of US exports come to Canada. So you can see there's great asymmetry there. Now, Canada is the United States' largest export destination. So in the Trump world, that puts us in good stead because he thinks of countries as customers. So we are customer numero uno. At the same time, you can see that there's great asymmetry there. And so it makes us quite vulnerable. And so historically, Canada, at least for the last century, whenever we're thinking about other countries, including trade diversification to the EU, as well as the Indo-Pacific, we're still thinking about the United States because 75% of our stuff is going there. So even as we seek to move the ship a little bit, we still have to think about where most of our exports are going. So this all might be changing our attitudes to trade diversification because we are being exposed to this big shock from the United States. And so just in the last few months, Canada is preparing to renegotiate the USMCA. But in the meantime, we're seeking tariff relief for steel and aluminum. This is stuff that's already happened in the EU, but Canada does not yet have any relief. Prime Minister Carney has also said that Canada will seek to diversify to other countries, including Europe and the Indo-Pacific. I think that's great, but I also think trade diversification has to be a constant project for Canada. You can't just start doing it when things are bad with the United States because it takes time. And interestingly, though, we do all of a sudden have some great statistics to show on trade diversification, but I think it's important for this audience to know why we're succeeding. And we're succeeding because energy is our #1 export. And just in the last few months, Canada has brought online an oil pipeline that takes oil out to the West Coast. Previously, all of our oil was southbound, and we were selling it at a depressed price. And so now we can sell it at a better price, and we're now selling more oil to China than we're selling to the United States. So, you know, I think people need to understand what successful trade diversification looks like for Canada, and it looks like natural resources going to new markets. The Prime Minister has also talked about wanting to increase trade within Canada. And I raise that because I'll come back to it when we get to the global trading aspects of this. But he has introduced, or the government will be introducing, new rules around public procurement that will require the use of Canadian steel, Canadian lumber, and other Canadian components. Part of this is because the US market is less available to us, and so we need to find somewhere to put our steel. The European Union is doing exactly the same thing with its own Buy EU steel plan. So as I bring this to the global order, I'm pretty cautious myself right now because I really think that we're in the midst of a reordering. I do think we're at a bit of a pivotal moment, but it's hard to see where we're going. And so, you know, Canada has essentially been shoved out into the ocean, but we're still actually quite close to shore. We can still see the United States, it's right there. Getting back to shore would be by far the easiest thing for us to do. So we're watching quite closely what's going to happen with the IBEI tariff case, court case, what's going to happen with the midterm elections. Can we just get back to shore? Because the alternative is to swim farther out into the ocean, and we're not quite sure where we're going. And the sea is pretty rocky. At the same time, I want to acknowledge that lots of globalization is still marching along quite well. South-South trade is doing quite well. This came up at a dinner we had last night. Trade that is not directly linked to the United States or China is going quite well. Trade both with those countries that is not considered sensitive is also going quite well. And so Canada is kind of in a very particular place because we're so tied to one of these superpowers. Now, I want to come back to this piece about our Buy Canada plan. Part of global countries are a number of us are engaged in this binational stuff, Buy EU, Buy Canada, and so on. And one of the things I'm worried about is that we're trying to do it in a manner not to alienate either the United States or China. So you'll see the EU talking about this and maybe not quite saying the word China or not quite saying the word, not alienate the United States or China. And Canada's doing the same thing. So one of the concerns that I have is that we're going to develop rules that will actually rule out each other, the other rules-bound open societies that are seeking to trade with one another. And so I'm quite concerned that we are in the process of violating our own trade agreements with each other as we seek to build these binational plans that will exclude one another, all because we don't want to do it in a manner that would upset the Americans or the Chinese. So as I think about where we're going, I don't know. I don't know for Canada. I do think that we should anticipate greater regionalized trade. I think it makes a lot of sense for the EU. It's already, you know, the EU, and it has a lot of power for all the reasons that Andres raised earlier. I do think there will be other regional trading blocs that also demonstrate a lot of opportunity to trade with one another and to kind of leave aside the United States and China. The challenge, of course, for Canada as well as Mexico is, will we be part of a North American trading bloc? Or is the United States going to continue to act in a very unilateral manner? There is interest in many parts of the United States in continuing USMCA, even in the Republican establishment. There's interest in bringing us together to work on trilateral projects that would create a strong North America that would largely deal with competition from China. But we really don't know if that vision is shared all the way to the inside of the White House and to President Trump himself. So we're a little bit in a holding pattern, waiting to see what that looks like. I think Canada and Mexico very much do want to be part of a North American trading bloc moving into the future, because frankly, the pain that we're experiencing right now is difficult, but we know that moving to a new order that doesn't, where the United States would no longer be our central trading partner, will actually be much more painful in the long term, or at least in the short term, as we kind of head out into sea and look for new opportunities.
Thank you, Meredith. Carlos, maybe the view from the private sector, not only from your sector, but kind of what's the role of the private sector and all this? What do you think about it?
Okay, a bit of both.
A bit more.
Bon dia a tothom, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's good to be back in my hometown every now and then. I think Andres has been here more often than me of late. A bit of publicity, if I may, but for a good reason, because people don't really know our sector. FedEx, DHL, and UPS are so-called integrators. They specialize in small package, fast transport, and they're called integrators because they do everything door to door, including cost of declarations, compliance for our clients. 40 million parcels every day, presence all over the world, 220 countries and territories. I challenge you, go to any city in the world, you'll see one of our vans driving around, or a bike, perhaps, e-bikes now, very popular. And this is not to say, oh, look at us, how important we are, perhaps a bit, yeah, okay. But it's also to say we have certainly our finger on the pulse of trade. Many financial analysts say if you want to see where the US economy is heading, look at UPS's or FedEx's or DHL's latest quarterly report, and it will tell you things, because one of our companies, one of our members say, in the network at any given time, there's 2% of the world GDP from, things that people with a small shop online sell internationally to, a big multinational sending their latest wonderful tablet that is going to be launched at a specific time worldwide, and they don't want anyone to see it before the event happens. So what do we see? What do we see? That's the question. And here I'm going to draw heavily from a study that DHL does with Stern at NYU, Professor Altman, called the Connectedness Report, which looks at globalization indicators, also our own statistics, and a little bit the WTO. And I will perhaps make a distinction between longer-term trends, such as you described, Simon, and the immediate effects of the upending of the system that President Trump has created. So, is globalization over? Certainly not. At least we do not see it. What we are seeing certainly is, and that's not new, it's been going on for a while, a decoupling of direct trade links between China and the United States. And those are significant, and those have pushed our members to shift capacity of late, even 25% off those routes to other routes, more regional routes, perhaps, inside East Asia to Australia, to Australasia, rather than across the Pacific from country to country. So that is a very clear trend. But does that mean that trade is breaking up into regional blocks? No. In fact, one very interesting little piece of statistics that they publish is that the average distance traveled by trade has increased. So that would indicate that globalization is far from dead, or perhaps not yet dead, I don't know. But so where we are going, as many others say, I don't know. What certainly we are seeing is a tremendous lot of uncertainty. Now, to the second point, what are the immediate effects of that upending of the international multilateral system as we know it. It's probably too early to tell, because what we've seen at the beginning of the year, and the latest reports from the WTO confirm that, we've certainly seen it in our networks, is a lot of front-loading ahead of tariffs. You know, you knew there were going to be tariffs at some point, and you didn't know how high they were going to be, but they were coming. So you said, okay, I'm going to bring inputs or even final products into my warehouses, and that just-in-time production system, well, we're going to hold stocks as much as we can in order to lower our cost for now. That, of course, is now coming to an end. I think we're starting to see it with inflation picking up in some places. But that meant that at the beginning of the year, immediately after the election of President Trump, trade went up significantly for the first quarter. Let's see what the second, the third, the fourth quarter tell us, but the first quarter clearly said it's going up significantly. Now, what happens next? I don't know. No one does. We're all in flux. We're all adapting very quickly. I can tell you that for us, it's almost weekly. And the other factor that I wanted to mention is the surge of e-commerce, which we see as a world of opportunity because it has created opportunities for micro enterprises to go global. Couple of years ago, I had to host something at the WTO and give a prize to young people who, you know, were young trade champions. And what I did was showing an example of exactly that. One of the companies had a client in Trinidad and Tobago, which was a small family-owned company, 4 family members, cooking hot sauce with red peppers. They had the simplest website saying, this is our product, a bottle of hot sauce, very powerful stuff, I can tell you. How many do you want? Where do you live? Give me a credit card. We ship it through Express. And indeed, 48 hours later, the box was there in Geneva, and I could show them the tracking of the product, how it had crossed the world from a little island in the Caribbean to the WTO in Geneva in 48 hours. So it's a huge opportunity, but it has led to a phenomenon where a massive amount of small parcels are now crossing borders. Many of them are valued under 200, certainly even under 50 euros. And customs lack the wherewithal to process that efficiently. So that's led to friction in many, many ways. Also because local businesses sometimes complain about big platforms, but the point is, it's introducing a lot of friction at the border. We certainly are seeing this today in the United States. They've been effective at shifting those volumes off the United States, or at least part of those volumes. But of course, it's not that they disappear. They're going to go elsewhere. Europe has already seen a 40% increase in those volumes. So we think that unless, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later on, border processes become a lot more sophisticated and technology-based, those frictions are going to come to a theater near you very, very quickly. And they will not only affect small parcels, they will affect everything. So those are the big trends we're seeing. But again, like you, I don't really know where we're going.
We'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the e-commerce from the regulatory parts, which is getting from the WTO, the US, issues with China, parcels and all this. I think we're going to expand a little bit on that, and also the role of technology, which I think is going to be very important. But let's hear from Luzma about maybe a perspective, maybe from the developing world on all this. I think would be a good thing to listen to you.
Sure, Tony. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you all today. Thank you, Tony, and thank you to those organizers. And also, it's a great pleasure to be in this panel with discussing these issues that for us are central. Well, as you said, I'm going to give the perspective of the developing world, which is not easy because the developing world is basically 3/4 of the world, which goes from 44 LDCs, least developed countries that have probably a per capita GDP of $2,000 a year, to China. No, so it's really difficult to talk about one developing world, where we know that one of the developing countries is one of the major actors that we have been listening to. So just to keep a little bit of perspective in terms of the importance of trade for developing countries. For example, in the General Assembly resolution on trade this year, we are once again underscoring the need to have a rules-based international trading system that is open, transparent, and that is with the WTO at its core. And that also is the same message is part of the Secretary General Trade Report. So we can tell you that the UN is not ready to relinquish the international trading system based on rules as we know it, not meaning that we think that it's perfect. Of course, it has a lot of room for improvement, but we are not ready to give up multilateralism, and we are not ready to give up an international rules-based trading system. And the reason, and I would like to discuss a little bit about that, is that we know that WTO, as very well explained by Simon, evolved from a US and UK arrangement, and the US basically developed a system where the US exercised leadership. But today, those rules apparently are not good enough for the US and the interests of the US. And also, the US has not recently, this is something that comes from, I would say, decades already, has complained about the effectiveness of WTO rules, for example, to discipline China in terms of its behavior and how it has evolved and grown and how it has positioned itself as the #1 exporter in the world and how China is dominating many areas. But not only China, for example, countries like India, which is also a developing country, has very high tariffs. On average, the simple average is 16%. And the US is frustrated with the lack of progress with 2 of the 3 pillars. Negotiations, already been said about the lack of progress. The Doha agenda, that basically the Doha development round is non-concluded. Nobody concluded it, but it's not concluded. And after 3 decades of existence of WTO, it has to show the trade facilitation agreement, which is not minor at all, because it's really effective in terms of reducing costs. And the fisheries subsidies agreement, which really is about reducing subsidies, but not about much more than that. Those are the 2 really multilateral agreements that WTO has been able to deliver. So the US is really frustrated with that. And the problem the developing countries in general have right now is that the US decided to do a unilateral round of trade negotiations, changing the rules of the game outside the system. And you may all remember the op-ed that was written by USTR Greer, saying that he was talking about the Trump round of trade negotiations. So this means that there's no more MFN, at least right now, for the policy that's coming from the White House. And no more special and differential treatment, which is major for many developing countries, especially the smallest ones, the most vulnerable ones, and the ones that really have no impact and no effect on US trade, on US investment, but those policies do have a real impact on these countries who are really suffering already. Deals are not done at the multilateral level. Deals are done at the bilateral level. Deals are not done based on the existing rules and what we have all known as the rules of the game. Rules don't count anymore, at least on the side of the US, and everything is based on power and market size. And this is very complicated, very complex for developing countries, because there's before, and as Tony was saying, I had the opportunity of participating in many negotiations throughout my career. And I mean, we all know that when you sit at the table at the bilateral level, there's little room for you to be able to negotiate something good for you. Well, now, without any multilateral rules or without a multilateral setting, it's really very difficult, especially for the smallest ones, to be able to come up with something that looks like an agreement that is balanced. Another issue is that the US with its new policy, has not only dismissed the MFN treatment, which is a basic one for a basic principle. Reciprocity has also been set aside, but free trade agreements that the US had in place, 14 free trade agreements with 20 countries, many of them in Latin America, but also a few with Morocco, Jordan, South Korea, are basically gone, no? So the question is that this is creating a lot of uncertainty, and it's really creating a new set of rules where the US is deciding how to come up with the kind of supply chains, the kind of investment and trade arrangements that serve its own national interest, defined as reducing a deficit, which is considered a national emergency, bringing back manufacturing jobs that were transferred abroad as a result of globalization, also increasing investment into the US, and very important, increasing tax collection, which is something that was not part of the equation. So these new tariffs that are called reciprocal tariffs are helping balance a fiscal equation in the US. So how are we seeing in UNCTAD the future for multilateralism? I completely agree with what has been said. I think globalization is here to stay. The question is, what are the rules that will allow that globalization to continue to happen? We are already seeing a slowdown in terms of the growth of trade and the growth of the world economy. We don't know exactly how. Trade has been resilient, but it has slowed down because the uncertainty does not allow trade and investment to happen in the same way. Enforcement of agreements is not done through law or rules, but now it's done through sanctions, tariffs, export bans, export controls. In fact, trade restrictive measures have increased by 4 since 2022, and the World Uncertainty Index has increased by 5 since the January of this year. So the problem for developing countries in general, including China, is that they rely on rules to attract investment and promote exports. The US has changed the nature of the rules, has changed the name of the game. And the question is how the rest of the world will respond. Although the US accounts only for 15% of world trade, and then we have the other 85%, the US has the capacity to muscle the kind of rules and trade that it was. Whether the WTO is the place to do that, we hope, because it's where everybody sits at the table, and there's no other place where countries can sit at the table. Right now, 166 members, where probably 20 are the most important in terms of the way of trade. Like 80% of trade is done by 20 countries, but the rest of the membership really relies on these rules. So we see that developing countries could be the big losers in all of this, especially the least developed countries. There's very little regional integration. For example, in Latin America, 15% of trade is done intra-Latin America. Africa is the same, 15%. ASEAN countries are the only ones that really have a regional integration. But developing countries really depend on WTO and international trade rules to be able to be part of supply chains, international trade, to be able to export. And this is not minor, because for some developing countries, especially the smallest ones, and in the case of Canada, 75% of its exports go to the US. But for many developing countries, exports represent basically 100% of their revenue for foreign exchange to be able to service their debt, or for foreign exchange to be able to import basic stuff like food. So for them, really having an international trading system that has certainty and clarity is really key. Now, how can we ensure that the system continues to work in such a way that works for everyone? It's not a minor question, of course.
Thank you, Maria. Maybe Cristina can offer kind of a local perspective on this.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. And yeah, my contribution is going to be more local and also more hands-on in the fact that my day-to-day is helping SMEs to export abroad. So basically, I'll try to give what we're experiencing as a small economy, and also what we're seeing the SMEs. If you'll allow me just a few seconds just to set the scene, but for those of you who don't know much about Catalonia, basically we're roughly the size, population, and GDP like countries like Finland or Denmark. And basically, we're the key driver of growth in Spain. 25% of the GDP, 26% of exports, of Spanish exports come from Catalonia. Very strong and diversified industrial base. Main sectors, chemical sector, automotive, food and beverage, which you probably think about a lot, but also life sciences and machinery. And in terms, we're a small and very open economy, and our export to GDP ratio is similar to that of Denmark or Sweden. So, and then the other characteristic, and I'll finish there, is 99% SMEs. But also out of these SMEs, which is similar than the rest of Europe, we have smaller SMEs. So out of these 99%, 98% have less than 10 people, so very small. So I think it's great that I come right after Luf, because I'm making a case that for small economies like ours, open trade is not an option. Basically, it's totally, we need open trade just to function and to grow. So it's not only about developing countries, but for small economies like ours to prosper, we must be connected to the world. We must be part of the system of rules-based system, part of this collaboration. So if you see the history of Catalonia, basically due to the European Union and the single market, we are what we are now. Our companies now can compete in the world, can innovate, and it would have not been possible if we hadn't been part of this single market. So we are attracting talent, foreign direct investment, etc., and we've grown. So basically, in the last 15 years, our exports have grown 70%, and basically trade accounts for 33% of our GDP. So there is not much more to that. So we need a rules-based open system to be able to prosper and grow. What are we seeing? So these are the facts. What are we seeing happening now? Globalization is not over by any accounts. Basically, in the last 2 years, our export volumes have been at historical highs. But we are seeing very much that rising costs for these, with these trade barriers, it's harder to export. I started in this business 20 years ago, and I always say for a company to start exporting now, it's harder than it was 20 years ago, much more. There's higher costs, especially for SMEs. Higher logistical costs, but especially compliance, all these regulations, trade barriers. And now we're in this chaotic confusion about all these executive orders that you don't understand anything when you read. And what does a small company who has only 2 people in their export department, how can they tackle this, right? Also, what have we seen? We've seen a few shifts in the flows of exports since the pandemic. Or just an example, in 2019, China was our number 9 destination. Obviously, our 61% of our exports go to Europe. So out of Europe, so China was number 9. Now, 4 years later, it's gone to 11th place. We've been trading a lot with the US. In the last 4 years, our exports to the US have increased by 70%. Also, the US has grown a lot. It's been, the key driver for growth in the kind of Western Hemisphere. And where are we going? I don't know. But for us, where are we going? I don't know. But 85% of the trade that Catalunya does is on a rules-based order. So yes, we're talking a lot about the Trump administration's tariffs, et cetera, all these things. But in fact, our day-to-day is still within this rules-based system. So I have a very good reason for optimism, right? And then we're seeing diversification, as also as Meredith pointed out, and we're pushing a lot for SMEs to diversify. Basically, we can go a bit more into what the policies from the regional government, but it's just basically 2 ideas: more Europe, single market. It needs to be a really, single market, and 2, diversification. And things are happening now. Just to put an example, we've been trying very hard for many, many years to sell fruit to Canada, and now they're listening to us, right? And this has been possible because things are changing. So other countries are being more receptive, and our companies are also, wanting to look out for other trading partners, apart from, the usual ones.
Thank you, Cristina. Simon, maybe just get a little bit deeper in kind of trying to get a short round of kind of much deeper questions into some of the details. And since you have launched recently the digital trade alert, let's talk a little bit about the kind of the growing importance of digital services in global trade. How do you see the regulatory framework for the digital sectors evolving? Are we seeing this fragmentation of jurisdictions in digital trade? What can what the global rules can actually help with that increasing jurisdictions?
So let me summarize that just 3 short points. One, yes, we have seen with the biggest players often adopting quite dissimilar rules, so that's a pressure for fragmentation. And you've heard people have written books called The 4 Internets and things like this. You can substantiate that point. Now come the 2 interesting twists. The second point is that it's clear that some countries which have at first put in very, quite frankly, heavy-handed regulations restricting the transfer of data even between companies have now realized that this is counterproductive. So you see in the case of China, experiments to allow pooling of non-confidential data between firms so as to be able to train models, large language models and others on bigger and bigger data pools. So interestingly, you see some countries pulling back from the overly restrictive. Okay? The third thing you're beginning to see is more and more countries, mainly at the middle power level, some smaller countries, negotiating and signing digital partnership agreements, or
The Singaporean
the agreements were essentially there's an attempt to try and, if not streamline and at least make more transparent the different types of policy intervention. And here I think is a recognition of the fact that here scale really does matter. That's kind of the second point I made as well. And that if you could allow pooling across a large number of smaller countries, then they could start creating pools of data which then can compete with the middle size and big players. So I think these are the structural drivers of what's going on. Of course, I suppose to go back to my first theme, The other, that's the commercial logic speaking along those three dimensions. One should not forget very quickly data-related issues can get tied up in security concerns too. And so this is the overlay on this, and we will see more of that tension. And I think one of the interesting challenges will be to try and identify which types of data flow do not trigger security considerations, and then can we create more of a safe harbor for the pooling of that data?
Meredith, maybe one question that kind of related to what we just discussed in the first round, and I think you brought about this, which is the resurgence of industrial policy. This is something that is happening across the world, many countries. But one interesting kind of dimension of the recent resurgence of industrial policy is the potential for coordination of industrial policy across the states. That's something that we have not seen in the past or in other experiments of industrial policy. You have written about this in the context of North America, potential for that. Can you talk a little bit about this, where you see this potential, the risks of doing that, or actually the opportunity for actually enhancing the competitiveness of specific regions that coordinate this type of policies? How do you see about?
Yeah, so I wrote about North American industrial policy under the Biden administration and the IRA that was mentioned earlier. And there was a real opportunity at that time under Biden to develop an industrial policy in which all three North American countries were essentially cooperating to develop a common industrial policy, particularly in the area of electric vehicles at the time. I think we all know much of that has been blown up. But I think there are still many opportunities for countries to work together on industrial policy. To some extent, the issues that Simon was raising, that I think they have to be plurilateral, in that there needs to be coalitions of the willing based on some kind of common set of values, economic indicators, that kind of thing. But it would be extremely inefficient for countries to try and go it alone. The United States is figuring this out pretty quickly, that they can't, build 100% American cars. They can't build 100% American, any number of advanced products. And they're being reminded of that every day. And so I think there's great opportunities to seek to work to combine both our unique comparative advantages that different countries bring, and in this new world that I think we're heading towards, combining that with risk mitigation. So COVID gave us a good shock, in that many countries ended up without the basics that they needed to survive. And so there was clearly a challenge to our resilience. And so we've been talking about resilience for the last few years. As we move forward, I think we can continue to take some of that risk mitigation. And so, you were talking about in the logistics world, we've moved from just in time to just in case. And so this need to stockpile and have what you need in order for your economy to function. Bringing those things together with the comparative advantage of different countries can work. And so in the case of industrial policy between North America, Mexico, and the United States, there is a model that says Canada can provide rich natural resources. We have many of the requirements, critical minerals that the world needs for the new economy. Mexico continues to have a very large labor force that can contribute to those goals, and also has some interesting digital AI pieces. And the United States can be an economic engine around advanced manufacturing. So there are ways to do this, but it does require agreement, and it also requires kind of sticking through it. So one of the challenges that we've had now with the United States is that the certainty we thought we had has totally evaporated. So as we move forward, if we try and develop new projects together that are trilateral in nature, how does Canada and how does Mexico get the certainty that we need in order to take the next step when we're currently dealing with a country that's constantly cheating on those rules? So I think I had a lot more optimism for this a couple of years ago than I do right now. But there are other countries that are not the North American model where this could still work very successfully.
Yeah, let me maybe bypass Carlos for a moment and go to Luz Maria, because I think just I'll go back to you, Carlos, but just on the USMCA, because you are on the other side, you are on the Mexico side. How Mexico can deal with, especially with the review coming up of the USMCA. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about this. In terms of collaborating more bilaterally with Canada, what's kind of can you see still the kind of a potential collaboration, the three countries together, or you see more bilateral approaches, even in specific industries? We discussed yesterday the case of the auto industry, which is very asymmetric interest by Mexico and by Canada in the context of the North American market. Can you maybe discuss a little bit about what would be if you could, in your current position, maybe just put your previous hat on as a negotiator?
Disclaimer, I should. Well, I now work for the UN, and I will make my comments based on how we are observing negotiations taking place. I think that what we are seeing, and from what we are observing with what is happening in North America, is that no matter if probably the US current trade policy has decided that they are having a more nationalistic and unilateral perspective, they still realize that they need the region. Of course, what will be the shape and form that will region take place, it's to be seen, but we know that at least there is a framework that is in place. The question here is, we know that the Trump administration prefers to have bilaterals, and that's something that we just saw with his the number of Asian agreements that just were announced. But there's one issue with USMCA, which is that it has a review clause that says that in 2026, either it's renewed or continues to be revised for the next many years, that the agreement could be in place. The problem we see with the US trade policy for every country and for WTO is the level of uncertainty and unpredictability, which is for us the highest tariff in place, because that's what introduces the most costs and the most complications for investors, for trade, for business. And we know that this review, we don't know if it's going to actually end up with a renewal in 2026, or it may end up being continue to be seen, that review. The other question is whether regionalism and supply chains that are aligned with the US will be one alternative, and then supply chains that are aligned with China will be the way to go in terms of the practical aspect of this. The US has also said very clear that they have a certain set of rules that go beyond WTO in services, in the digital economy, in e-commerce, investment, and all those issues that have to do with regulations of state-owned enterprises and NTMs and all that are very different from the WTO framework, or go beyond the WTO framework, because those issues have not been able to be solved, that address supply chains, but that are different from the China model. So what we may end up seeing is those, in general terms, I'm not saying that they will be completely isolated, because I really don't think that the US and China can decouple. I mean, it's too difficult for those two main actors in the global economy to decouple. But there will be some trends in terms of being able to participate, and that goes back to what Simon was saying about security and issues that have to do more with high politics rather than competitiveness and trade.
Thank you. Carlos, back to you. One question that I think you mentioned, and I'd like you to expand a little bit more, basically all the kind of the logistics sector that you work on. One is uncertainty on the regulatory framework. Maybe you can explain a little bit more where we are on this, especially on the WTO moratorium on e-commerce, the recent US regulations on the parcels from China, how this is affecting kind of these regulatory frameworks affecting your industry today. But maybe more importantly, how new technologies can actually be potential solutions to that. Can you use and adapt technologically to this volatility, to this uncertainty? There's a role for technology to overpass this kind of regulatory uncertainty.
Thank you. Very good question. The short answer is yes, but. Why? Well, let me start perhaps with a famous quote in our industry. Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, famously said once, the data about the parcel is as important as the parcel itself. The thing is, he said this in 1978. So he was this visionary guy who said, we have to go to a data-driven model. And the three companies are pioneers in this area. I'm sure you've seen the barcode that comes on a parcel. That is associated with loads of information that we have about that parcel. Do we have all the information? No, that is something I can talk about. But we have a lot of information, and we can transmit that information from the minute it's picked up by the driver and scanned. We can start sending raw data, and then as the parcel travels, we can elaborate that into a proper formal customs declaration with HS codes, etc., etc. Now, are we investing in technology? Yes, pioneers, as I said, but there are two issues here. One is technical, it's interoperability. We can send lots of information. We don't have all the information. Can it be received and processed at the other end? The answer is not everywhere. And there's, of course, the risk of a technology trap at some point where you say, it has to be blockchain. Well, no, we have to design something that is technology neutral. So that whatever technology you use, you can talk to other systems. And that would help tremendously. The other one is regulatory. So we are investing heavily in AI, because when you ship 40 million parcels a day, you can train AI to help you with things like custom specification. What is the harmonized system code that should be associated with this import? And that can help tremendously. We're also using it for routing. Weather patterns are changing. Even at a van level, you could say, okay, considering what kind of parcels you have in your van today, this is your optimal routing. So there's lots of things that can be done. Also, we use it for compliance, know your client. Sometimes we shut down accounts because someone is really a rogue trader. They tend to appear the next day under a different address and a different name, but with AI, we're better at spotting them because we don't want them in our networks. We want to be compliant. It's part of the business model. Problem there, regulatory. And here, for instance, the trade facilitation agreement, of which we're huge champions. If you go on our website, you will see a database with lots of KPIs on facilitation. It was concluded the negotiation in 2017, I think. Of course, it's a multilateral negotiation. It is what it is. You have to bring everyone on board. There is a weak spot, and the weak spot is technology. So all things associated with what I would call an e-border are not very strong in the treaty. It's a lot of what trade negotiators call best endeavor clauses. Mm-hmm. You shall try to, but it's not an obligation. So we've been for a long time saying, as part of some talks in the WTO, we ought to move to a TFA plus at some point where these things are addressed. We're also in a thing called the Digital Standards Initiative of the International Chamber of Commerce, where they're trying to come up with digital standards for all trade documents, rules of origin, certificates, and all the paper that usually has to travel with goods, that it could be digitalized, not scanned, that it's just data, computers talking to computers. Regulatory problem there. In many countries, there is no equivalence from a legal standpoint between data records and the same thing printed on a piece of paper. It has to be a piece of paper or a scanned piece of paper, but the information itself, the zeros and ones, do not have legal value. So you cannot present that to customs. It won't accept it. Similar with HS codes developed by AI. Some customs will say, no, I can't accept that. It has to be signed by a customs broker. So the solutions are there, but and many administrations, if you talk to them privately, will say, yes, we have a very clear vision, but we know that this has to go through Parliament. And that is a massive hurdle. For instance, on the recognition of data as having exactly the same legal value as the same thing printed on a piece of paper, there is an international standard, a model law developed by UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference for International Trade Law. It's a terrible acronym. They call it MELITA, but it's really the model law for the exchange of electronic records or trade records. Can't remember exactly what it is. It's MELITA. Yesterday we were talking about where we see innovation in that area, and you've alluded to it, Simon. And here the innovation is coming from the East. Who has signed MELITA? The UAE, Singapore. Who has developed digital trade treaties that recognize these things? Singapore, Chile, Andres has left, unfortunately, New Zealand, Korea, all in the Pacific Basin. They are starting to put in place digital agreements that say, yeah, we will even recognize computers talking to computers directly as having the value of a customs declaration. And what we like very much, selfishly, about those agreements is that they say, okay, think also that the expansion of digital trade, I'll come to your point on the moratorium, the expansion of digital trade has an effect on physical trade. If you have very strong digital connections, that will result in more physical trade of goods. You need to think about logistics. It's not a regulatory framework, but it's just a pointer saying it's not just digital. Think that someone needs to finally move the stuff around. So you want to open up logistics and have a very progressive regime for logistics as well, because they go hand in hand. So the more modern and forward-looking thinking is coming from the Pacific Basin today, not from Europe, not from the United States. And that's really tells you something. On the moratorium, we are traders in services that cater to traders in goods and in services as well. The moratorium, I don't know how well people are familiar with it, since 1998, I think. At the WTO, there was an agreement that data transmissions, the zeros and ones that go across borders, would be exempt from tariffs. So they said, we don't really know what this trade is going to be, but for now, we want to keep it tariff-free. And every MC, every ministerial conference of the WTO had on the agenda a renewal of this moratorium. And it got harder and harder and harder because some countries, Indonesia and others, started to say, no, this is becoming so important. It's a revenue issue. I want to slap tariffs on data. Now, the OECD here said, that's a very bad idea because it's very difficult to have a customs declaration for a data transmission. There might not be any intrinsic value. There might be. It's better if you just put a consumption tax or a sales tax on it. But some countries wouldn't have it. And this came to a head at the last two ministerial conferences where probably 40% of the time was devoted to this thing. And in the end, it was some horse trading and the can was kicked down the road a few meters. At the last one, they said it would not be renewed this time. And that was very serious. I'm optimistic in that I think this decision might be reversed because people realize. I mean, yesterday at dinner we said, what is the intrinsic value of a Netflix film? Where does it come from? What's the rule of origin? It's better to say, okay, pay me 20% VAT on your subscription. That's straightforward. The other thing creates a huge mess in terms of customs declarations and data transmissions. And frankly, I mean, in some places, for instance, there are accounting firms that send data for the books to be processed in a country and then overnight they come back. If suddenly that data transmission is subject to a tariff. I don't know how they will calculate it, but probably they wouldn't do it. They would repatriate that or find someone else. So the trade distortion aspect of not renewing the moratorium is huge. But I hear, as slightly pessimistic about the reform drive in the WTO as I am, I think here we might see some progress. So again, technical issues, regulatory issues, is there. Yes, it can help a lot, but you have to do the heavy lifting, which is turning this into regulations.
Since we are running quickly out of time, I think we'll have just like 10, 15 minutes more. Let me just go quickly, just a quick round, maybe starting with you, Cristina. Half minute or even a minute, so we maybe have a couple of questions from the public. This is a question for all of you. If you should think about a very concrete step, something that should happen at the national level, maybe at the multilateral level, something that could happen in, let's say, 2026, that could restore some sort of confidence in the multilateral system, that as we know it, that could provide some optimism that things could, that we could still maintain the system for a while. Anything that you could think about what could be done? Maybe in your case from the European Union, maybe in the case of Meredith, we were discussing last night about the potential for strengthening a different type of relationship between Canada and Europe, for example, out of the CETA. Can you think about something? And you can, anyone who has already thought about this, could start doing this.
And I think in the European Union case at least, but I think it could then, increase, with, other countries. I think in all the green economy and what is all the sustainability issues, because this, we find sustainability as being, for SMEs, really burdensome, trying to comply with all the regulatory framework. And it's extremely, extremely fragmented within the European Union. And we've had so many issues around that. So I think, focusing on, standardizing regulation in sustainability. And I think because it's so fragmented, it is not working in the EU. If we try to do that with other similar countries, just get the ones that are still believing in sustainability issues and approaching that. And it may also be, kind of a motor, an engine to kind of reshape and restructure what's happening in the EU. And then, we could use, economies or regions like Catalonia as a test bed, to do that. I think that could be an idea.
Anyone else?
Well, I've been talking about North America the whole time, so I'll make my plug for Canada-EU relations, and I'll start with Canada's current ambassador, Spain's ambassador to Canada, Alfredo Serrano Martinez, is a huge champion for Catalonia. And so I think if you're making gains with Ottawa, some of it might be because you have a very talented ambassador in place. On the Canada-EU piece, though, I would say two things that I think we need to do, and I worked on the Canada-Europe agreement, and so it's close to my heart. I am constantly and endlessly frustrated that we seem to always focus on very, very minor issues. We seem to be very comfortable in the broad issues with each other, and so we focus on tiny little things, geographical indications, small little problems, and we almost take for granted that the situation couldn't get worse. And the situation absolutely could get worse. Imagine if you had elected new governments that were completely anti-trade, and then the whole agreement could just go sideways. And so my plug would be that I think we have to be much more urgent about focusing on the big picture and trying to work towards that. And on regulation, I really think that we need to be doing more in the area of mutual recognition of regulations rather than seeking to force others to comply with the EU standards. So, The Brussels effect around regulation is very strong. The assumption is always that other countries should comply with the European rule because, oh, it's so hard to get all of our countries to agree and we have this regulation, so therefore you other country must come into our regulation. What would be much more efficient for companies and would be much less barriers and much less red tape would be if we actually just recognized each other, noticing that we're all advanced economies, we all have strong labor and environment standards, and so there's no reason that we can't just recognize each other's existing standards.
Yeah, totally agree.
Anyone?
From a global industry, it's been alluded to before. I think it's vital to keep a multilateral system that's transparent and stable and can evolve. And that's where the WTO has failed a little bit. So in March next year, there will be the 14th ministerial. Reform is on the agenda, finally. It would be really good to see an effort by all countries, and with probably the private sector pushing to see a genuine reform agenda between now and 3 years from now. And I think there are three key areas for us, talking from a private sector perspective. One is certainly opening up to the private sector. The WTO is pretty close to using the private sector as a sounding board. We're not negotiators. It's an intergovernmental organization. But unlike other international organizations, the private sector has a very little role to play structurally in the organization. So that's one. Second, you mentioned like-minded countries being able to move on. There's a challenge now to plurilaterals, which is in WTO parlance agreements by some but not all members. Some members are saying, no, that's not within the rules. They need to find a compromise so that those who want to advance can and stop holding everyone else hostage to specific positions. And part of that would be, and we alluded to that yesterday, the consensus rule. In principle, the WTO works on consensus. It can vote. It's never done. It's never done. But there's also a confusion that consensus means unanimity, and it doesn't. So right now, one country can veto. And these three things are essential building blocks of a multilateral system that can evolve. And I hope that everyone exerting leadership and vision beyond narrow self-interest will be able to come to a compromise in Yaoundé in March and launch a movement for reform of the system, which is not perfect, but it's really important and has very positive effects.
Great.
Can I be a bit critical of my colleagues up here? Because I don't think they've listened to Andres at all. Andres said, look, framing is everything. Technocrats talk to each other. You've just heard a whole series of technocratic answers about how to rebuild confidence. The biggest threat at the moment is the exacerbation of fears about what the United States is going to do, where China is going to send its exports, all of these areas. What I have been doing with my team in the last 12 months is trying to find, whenever new data comes out, go back and look at the numbers, how many of the scare stories add up, which ones do not. This morning, China's October trade data was released, which means we will now have 3 months of trade data since the Americans raised their tariffs a lot. We should be able to see if there is any of this Chinese redirection of exports. I can assure you, and I will look at the Financial Times article during the break, that I'm sure they have done yet another scare story. And what happens is those articles will be read by people who are not so much in the technocratic, who are advising decision makers, and this will then harden opinions, which will stop all of the stuff that Carlos wants happening at the ministerial conference, because everyone's distrust is going to be elevated. So my advice is, remember what Andres said, and one useful role that people like ourselves can play is in going through the latest data and highlighting the huge amount of misleading, fear-driven, divisive media coverage and analytical writing by partisans who either want to bash the United States, bash China, or both. That would be my advice.
So your concrete step is to subscribe to GTA. You know, everybody should. That's a good way of.
No, but I mean, there's. If,
Very good. Yeah.
Let's stop.
Thank you, Simon. Maria Dolce.
Well, if I may add my 5 cents, as our SG, Madam Rebecca Greenspan, SG of UNCTAD says, multipolarity is a reality, multilateralism is a decision. So if we want to continue in a world where we have rules that from a developing perspective and from developing countries, but also from the small ones all over the world, small and medium-sized companies are also equally affected by the unilateral actions of one actor. We still see that there is room to continue to work in WTO. We have to observe whether countries, many of these deals are violating basic principles, MFN and reciprocity. So what is the rest of the membership going to do with that? Are they going to emulate that behavior? Are they going to just let that be treated as an exception? Are they going to start dispute settlement cases questioning the validity of those agreements? I think that that's to be seen, but at the end of the day, we need to be seeing the big perspective. And from a developing perspective, we also see that there is huge room for more South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation meaning increasing trade among Latin America, Asian countries, African countries, including, each one of them within their own regions. Why we say this? Because sometimes we see that normally we tend to think that because everyone produces the same or in the same sector, then there's nothing to be traded. And that's not the case. For example, in fisheries, we know that maybe one country may be good at producing, Ecuador may be good at producing shrimp or at exporting shrimp. And then maybe somebody in Africa may be good at exporting certain kind of fish. So there's room for more trade to happen. But for that, you need WTO.
Thank you very much. Let me just please join me on thanking this great panel. And I think we will have a break for like 30 minutes. And we'll be back for the second session of the morning. Thank you very much.